Hi guys, I'm back. I'm back with more side-by-side Windows versus Linux footage, but this is a really interesting one because one of the hot button topics at the moment is whether 8 GB VRAM graphics cards are effectively dead in the water. And that's where I'm going to concentrate. I'm covering two things here. Obviously, there's Windows versus Linux in this particular game, Oblivion Remastered. But there's a very important point about 8 GB of VRAM when it comes to Windows versus Linux. And there's an issue of longevity that I'm going to discuss because there's a growing opinion, and I happen to now 100% agree with it. I was a bit on the fence maybe a year ago. I thought maybe, okay, you dial back settings, it's workable. Now, as hardware on unboxed have shown, and I happen to agree with this. 8 GB is pretty much dead and buried. There's just too many AAA games that are coming out that consistently push or exceed this 8 GB VRAM buffer, leading to all kinds of issues. And this is definitely a topic I'm going to spend some time on in future videos. I'm definitely going to do a much deeper dive than I'm doing in this video. This is just a kind of a taster with a really new game that's kind of highlighted the issues with an 8 GB VRAM buffer. I'm going to do several games in another video. Windows versus Linux, I'm going to show the differences, and I'm going to show, the TLDR in it is 8 GB of VRAM on Windows is dead. And I think Steve from Hardware Unboxed has, in the last video he did, I think he put it to bed, finally. I think he showed so many games with modest graphics settings that were consistently going over the buffer and leading to all kinds of issues, including stuttering, hitches, textures not loading in properly, degradation of performance, pop-in, animations not loading. There's at least maybe 10 to 12 different issues that can be caused by a lack of VRAM, and these are things I'm going to try and highlight in a deep dive video that I'm going to do. So if you're interested in that really technical type of content where I show examples and I go through numbers and I do all the calculations and percentages and so on, then if you haven't already, please subscribe, because there's a lot of that interesting type of content coming up. And I'm going to have a call to action as well. I want people to discuss in the comments what their experience with 8 GB VRAM graphics cards is on both Windows and Linux. What kind of issues are you encountering? Are you able to get around them? Are you kind of stuck with your 8 GB VRAM card? Down in the comments. I'm going to get stuck in the comments and get into the conversations with you and get the feedback from the comments and take it forward into future videos on this subject, because it's become a very big subject of late. But as I said, TLDR is 8 GB of VRAM on Windows is dead, as far as me, Steve from Hardware Unboxed, and many others. Many in the gaming community agree with this, and the upshot is that if you have an 8 GB GPU and you're using Linux, it just buys you a little bit more time. I think you just have a little bit more headroom to increase texture settings. Um, Even on Windows, there are games where it doesn't matter what you do, you still run out of VRAM. You could go down to low settings at 1080p quality upscaling and still run out. So Linux has a bit of headroom, and the drivers and so on do manage VRAM better than Windows. Okay, so that's something I'll demonstrate in this and future videos. And this video, I'm going to show you an example with Oblivion Remastered. So let's bring up the video footage and move myself out of the way of the Linux specs here. Let's move myself into position. There we go. And this is, as I said, side by side. Now, you can pause because there are a lot of numbers here, okay? I like to be data driven, okay? So I like, the differences between things, like the Mint Linux 1% lows being 74% better than on Windows, which is a very significant thing I'm going to demonstrate. But also important to show things like kernel versions, Mesa drivers, what, on the Windows side, all the latest updates, the latest stable release of Adrenaline 25.3.1. The Linux kernel is the absolute latest stable version available, and the Mesa drivers are again the latest stable version available. You do have to go out of your way to install this kernel and this driver and the firmware if you've got RDNA 4, okay, which is something I'll cover in another video. But for this one, it's RDNA 2. Yeah, I think it's RDNA 2 we're talking about, with the 6650 XT, which, as I said, is an 8GB VRAM graphics card. We're running a pretty high-end CPU, so CPU bottlenecking isn't really a thing. Although, with the way games are going these days, even something like this could end up with a bottleneck. Even in Oblivion Remastered, there are times when it does hit the CPU, even when you should be 100% GPU bound. And 32 gigabytes of RAM, etc. So it's a pretty good foundation to run a 6650 XT and get some good insight into its performance and its usage of VRAM. Okay, so I'm going to play this now. This is 1080p, medium. Okay, so medium textures, medium everything, and FSR3 quality. And I've selected this because personally, and I think a lot of people would agree with this might be the absolute minimum you'd want to ever go to. Okay, even if you've got, let's say, 1080p display, you're not going below this. Some people won't even employ quality level upscaling at 1080p, they don't like it. And there's a lot of fizzling and so on. It's not, the image quality does have a bit of breakup at these settings, but it's playable. It should be, in my view, the absolute minimum that a game should be optimized for. Absolute minimum should be 60 plus FPS. And to be fair, in this section, and I've been all over the land. I've been through Oblivion gates, I've been in towns, etc. And this area here is as good as any. Lots of foliage, grass, lighting, shadows. The daytime doesn't really make much difference here. I've tested it with brighter conditions, darker conditions. Doesn't make any difference at all really to the level of stuttering and so on. So you can see, as you keep an eye on the frame time graph here, extremely stuttery with lots of hitches, way beyond just traversal stutter. You will see some traversal stutter on the Linux side as well. So I'm going to go back here a little bit, and you will notice the occasional little hitch there. So you see that one there? That's just traversal stutter. That's your usual UE5 traversal stutter. Otherwise, there's another one, and every time I go past that point, I get that. So that's definitely traversal stutter. Otherwise, it's pretty smooth on the Linux side, but as you see on the Windows side, extremely noisy. And you'll see that the 1% lows are 34, okay, whereas they're 59 actually on the Linux side. So let me just pause it here for a second. And you can look at the VRAM usage. The VRAM usage is being reported as just under the 8 gigabytes. Okay, so we're looking at maybe, give or take, maybe 7.6 or 7. Okay, when you do your calculations there in terms of gigabytes. Okay, so actually let's call it 7.8. Okay, and on the other side we've got 7.9. So they're both pushing the 8 gigabyte VRAM buffer. Now they're both, I think, going over the buffer, but Linux does a much better job of managing this overflow. Whenever you push that 8 gigabytes, it does a much better job of preventing stutters and popping and all that kind of stuff. Okay, so I'm going to have to delve into exactly why that happens, but the evidence is there that it does. I know this goes a good bit above the VRAM buffer because of the RAM usage. The RAM usage started off at 13 or so gigabytes, and now it's well over 16 gigabytes. Okay, so the base game loading in brought it up to 13 gigabytes, and then as the VRAM buffer gets exceeded, it creeps up over that over time. And another thing to note is that there is only 6.5 gigabytes allocated to the game itself. That means the game is running at 6.5 gigabytes of the VRAM buffer. It means there's about a gigabyte and a half that it can't use because it's been allocated to other processes. I don't have, it's a little bit harder to get it. Mango HUD here on Linux doesn't really give you that kind of per process information. But I'll discuss that in a second. I'll show you what it's likely to be, okay, because we can kind of infer from other data what this or the amount of VRAM buffer that's available for Linux, okay, and it's actually around 7.3. So here we have 6.5. Over here, it's going to be allocating about 7.3 gigabytes to the game, which means that if there's going to be any spillover of VRAM, it's going to be much less, okay, and with various techniques like caching and caching algorithms and so on, it could do a better job on Linux than Windows, particularly when it's got more VRAM to play around with. So let's continue on here. Okay, I'm going to move on to this, and I'll pause briefly. Now this is, what do you do when you run out of VRAM? You reduce the settings to the best of your ability. And we're now down to kind of, I would say, Steam Deck settings. Okay, not acceptable on a desktop, not acceptable on this GPU, but even with what I would consider, handheld settings, it's still, the GPU here, 93% underutilized, stuttering very badly. VRAM is still maxed out. Can't feed enough frames into the GPU to make a GPU bound. Okay, so not very good. There's very little you can do to improve performance. It is really what you'd call a stutter fest. So let me move over here. Let's look at some Linux footage. Just in case you're wondering, is it just that area that performs reasonably well? Well, I'm in a city area here with NPCs and so on, and it's similar performance, very similar performance. In fact, it goes a little bit higher at times, up into the 80s. So I would say quite satisfactory. What about on horseback when you're traveling more quickly through the countryside? You're obviously more prone, as you can see there, to traversal stutter. It's expected. Just about every game on UE5, especially open world ones, you're going to have it. Nothing you can do. It's not your GPU. It's not your VRAM. It's just UE5. But otherwise, aside from the traversal stutter, there's very few times when you're going to get these hitches and so on. I would say, even though it does go down into the 50s, sometimes even into the 40s, but that's just because of the GPU load. And now, I'll just pause it there because, on this channel, I want to be absolutely 100% balanced. I'm not a Linux fanboy, I'm not any fanboy, I'm not an AMD fanboy, even though I've produced videos in the past saying that AMD plus Linux, beats the hell out of Windows plus AMD or Nvidia or whatever. I've made those statements because I've been able to back them up with the data. Okay, so I'm evidence driven, and here again, I'm going to show you something on the Linux side. Now, I don't know if this happens on Windows as well. Down in the comments, let me know if you've experienced these types of issues. But there are times when there's a certain event. It could be a UI event, or it could be an update in the background, I would say, maybe going into the creation engine or something, like we're drawing power from a well here. Okay? Now, note the frame rate was up into the 60s and 50s, and then suddenly it plummets down into the 30s and 40s, and it stays there. Now, it's not VRAM. VRAM is 7.3 gigabytes, or at least if it's VRAM, it's an unusual issue of VRAM with maybe a bug to do with VRAM, but otherwise it's, you know, you can see it got very stuttery as well. So I can't explain that. When you reload the game then, after that, okay, so that's all I did. I just quit out of the game. I saved it, I quit out of the game, reloaded it, cleared everything out, and we're back over 70 FPS again. Okay, so it's annoying. It means you have to save and restart, but it does fix the issue for a while. And it could be 1 minute, it could be 10 minutes, it could be a 2-hour session before you see the issue again. But it does occur. I didn't see it on the 9070 XT, okay, but you know, I haven't put lots of hours into the 9070 XT, so I can't say for sure that it doesn't happen on there, but certainly happened on the 6650 XT. And you know, back to normal, 70 odd, 80 FPS, very good performance, quite smooth. But it did happen again later on, as we'll see here. I'm going to stop and I'm going to actually open the map, and that seems to trigger a bug. Okay. No, like I said, I don't know if this is specifically a Linux bug, and whether maybe in a patch it'll get fixed. So we go into the map, I'm having a look around. Okay, great. That's where I'm going, and then, lo and behold, out of the map I come, and it's back. 30 odd, 40 FPS, okay? Even though the VRAM is at 7.9, you know, it's not that. It can't be that really. It's just a bug that needs to be fixed. Whether it will be fixed, if it's Linux specific, will they fix it? I don't know. They obviously should, okay, because there's been an uptick in interest in Linux gaming of late, especially with PewDiePie releasing a video that's been looked at millions of times. Okay, so I'm going to run some numbers now. Let's go through this here. Okay, move myself out of the way again. Okay, so here is Linux Mint 22.1. I've given you all the drivers and the firmware, Mesa, kernel, etc. Cinnamon 6.4.8. Okay, this is, as far as I'm aware, X11 rather than Wayland based. I think it's more the KDE desktops tend to be Wayland. So Wayland seems to be the way forward, but X11, you know, I think it depends really. There's usually not much of a difference, but sometimes depending on the game or the application, there can be a difference between whether everything on screen has been drawn by X11 or Wayland. I mentioned the specs, Core i7 13700K, 6650 XT, 32 gigs of RAM. And when you boot straight in clean after an install, look at this, you're under 200 megabytes of VRAM. Okay, it's a very low footprint. You can get lower if you installed a different desktop, XFCE, or there's even more minimal ones than that. No, the danger is when you do that, that they may not have everything that you need for every application. You may encounter a Steam issue or something like that. But you know, I think when you're below 200 megabytes when you log in, I don't think there's any great issue there. You can see it's just over 2% usage. Okay, so I'll just rattle through these because and bring this video to a conclusion, because I don't like when videos go too far beyond 20 minutes. Okay, when I open the Steam UI, we're up around 600 megabytes. You can see that's over 7%, but we still have nearly 93% of our VRAM available. When we load into the game with silent Steam, this means I'm running it from the command line, and it's not going to load in the graphics, the UI, which will take up a little bit of VRAM. We can save maybe 100 or 200 megabytes doing this. Okay, so you can see now we're up to 3.9 million bytes, I think, millibytes, is that what you call it? It's not 1024, it's 1000 per, you know, megabyte. That's the calculation. But we'll call it 3.9. Okay, and or 3.8. Let's call it 3. It's rounded to 3.8. But when you launch from the GUI, you know, there's an extra 100-ish megabytes. Okay, so you know, it means you have to either set up a script, you know, a one-click script or something like that on your desktop, or run it from the command line or whatever, you might save yourself a little bit, especially if you're right on the edge. But whether it's worth the effort, maybe it's not. So that's just bear in mind these numbers when you load in. 3.9, okay, 3.9. Windows, okay, so I do run debloat scripts, okay, so that's a PowerShell script that gets rid of all sorts of things like the Xbox game bar and a few other bits and pieces that take up VRAM and can add to the CPU load and cause micro stutters or the odd hitch here and there. So I suppose you'd call it a non-invasive one. It's one that gets rid of all the kind of common stuff that you're advised to get rid of, and doesn't do anything that risks breaking Steam or anything like that. So, but I think it's as much as any kind of intermediate user should be expected to do to kind of reduce the bloat on Windows. I could get rid of other things like desktop effects or whatever, but how far do you expect people to go? That's my question. With Linux Mint, I didn't do anything other than just click a button and install it, and it was at 200 megabytes of VRAM usage. So that's immediately after boot up. When I open Steam, you can see there nearly 500 megabytes added. When we load in Oblivion, we're at just under, it says 5 there, but when you do the 1024 calculation, it's about 4.8 or 9 gigabytes. So we're looking at about an extra gigabyte of usage that we've lost. Okay, now it mightn't be quite that much. It might be 7 to 1,000 megabytes. Okay, 700 to 1,000. But you can see there is a certain amount that's just not available to the game. Now, this is the final slide before I finish up, but there's one important point. It's one I've made, I think, before. And if you're anyway kind of mathematically inclined, this will make perfect sense, because people think, when you go from 8 gigabytes to 12 gigabytes, you're getting 50% extra VRAM for your game. No, you're not, because you have to remember there's a certain amount allocated, and it could be a small amount or it could be a larger amount. It could be a couple of 100 megabytes, or it could be up to a gigabyte, and maybe if you do some trimming on Windows, maybe you get it down, towards 500 or 600 or 700 maybe, if you're lucky. Okay, but you can certainly save a lot on Linux. Okay, but what you have to remember then is, if you get an extra 4 gigabytes, that's 4 gigabytes in the case of Windows here. When I was running the game there, let's say I lost 1.5 gigabytes. Okay, so 3.3 here plus 1.5 gets you up towards that 5,000 megabytes. Okay, so an extra 4 gigabytes would be the percentage of 4 divided by 6.5. Okay, so you're talking about, what is that, 60% or something like that? Not 50% extra, but maybe 60+% extra. Okay, depending on how much VRAM bloat you've gotten rid of. So I don't think people appreciate that enough. 4 gigabytes is more in percentage terms than just another 4 on top of 8. Okay, just bear that in mind. So these were the figures that I looked at earlier, 5 and 4. Okay, so there's 1,000 megabytes of a difference. And if we assume the baseline VRAM usage in my example, okay, with modest debloating, is 1.5 gigabytes. Now, write down in the comments what you do to debloat, whether you think it's invasive or do you end up breaking anything. What can you get it down to? Okay, give your hints and tips down below in the comments about how you reduce Windows bloat, and I'll have a look at them and see if there's anything I can do that I think is realistic to do, that the average intermediate user can do. So in my example, okay, there was about 6.5 gigabytes left for the game. Okay, and when if you look back at the video footage, you'll see that there's about 6.5 gigabytes allocated to that to the dedicated process. Okay. Whereas on Linux, I'm going to assume the baseline VRAM usage with with the base desktop and Steam and so on is about 700 megabytes. Okay. There's no great need to debloat when you're at that level. Okay, when you've got a kind of a fresh install of Linux Mint with Cinnamon, and you don't put anything fancy in there. As I said, you could use a desktop with a smaller footprint, but it does give you, in my example, 7.3 gigabytes for your game, and that's actually an extra 12% VRAM. Okay, about 1/8. Okay, let's call it an extra 1/8. So I think it uses more than an extra 1/8. I think there's an element of the drivers being more careful with the allocation of VRAM, with caching, etc. Okay, so I think there's definitely a performance improvement on Linux versus Windows. So anyway, fun fact was that with Linux I was well under the 16 gigabytes the whole time, whereas on Windows, on pretty much a stock install, there's very little extra on there that did go over 16 gigabytes. So for anyone running a 16 gigabyte system, this is one of those games that could definitely push you over that limit. But anyway, that's pretty much it. It's certainly a hot button topic, as I said. Lots of talk about 8 gigabyte graphics cards being dead in the water. I tend to agree. My question to you is, do you agree? So subscribe, like the video to boost this profile, comment down below, and let's talk about 8 gigabyte graphics cards. I think there's pretty much a consensus on it now, but I'd love to see a conversation down below. So anyway, with that, and with all those numbers swirling around in your head, I'll say goodbye, and I'll see you in the next video.